Welcome. This is a great crowd. I'm so happy that you're all here. Isn't it great that it was sunshiny today? Right? And we didn't have to put salt out on the sidewalk to get you in the door. That's a fabulous thing. So you bring us good luck. It's really fabulous to have you here. Mr. Starita has been a friend of the Center for Faith Studies for a long time. Cindy Kugler, who started the Center for Faith Studies, brought him in the very first time, and when I first started here almost 9 years ago now, he was a guest. And I was so mesmerized with your conversation that it led me into doing some research on the Native Americans in Nebraska, because I'm not naturally from Nebraska either, so I got to learn a whole bunch of new stuff about where I live now. And that's always a great thing for me, is to be able to expand something that I knew nothing about into a passion and an interest that I can now serve in a social interest way, in a social activism way, in a way to advocate for all those voices who are on the margins and aren't always heard. So that's what Center for Faith Studies stands for. It's what we try to do the most of. And so we encourage any kind of speaker and audience we can to enter the conversation with these folks, to listen to voices that we wouldn't necessarily hear otherwise. So, Joe Starita, we are so happy to have you here. He is a professor at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. He teaches journalism classes, and his interest in American Indian history is what led him to Nebraska, back to Nebraska, where he's from, in order to start writing books and to do some research. And that's what led him back to us. So we're very excited to have him here with us. Would you please help me welcome Mr. Joe Starita.
Testing, testing. How's that? Good. Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I'm a pacer, so I probably will. I don't think authors in general are nearly as grateful as they should be for these kinds of opportunities. I don't want to be one of those kinds of authors, so I want to tell you right from the very get-go, these are things that, are really important and that I really cherish. I am going to probably spend about 45 minutes trying to convey to you how madly in love I am with this woman. And it's obviously going to be unrequited, but I want to give you some feel for this 2.5-year labor of love and how important I think these stories are, how important I think they are to all of us. But before wading into all of that, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that I am very grateful for these opportunities, the opportunity to tell you why I love this woman so much and why we should all be proud of this woman so much. Nebraska may not be for everybody, but it was for Susan. And for most of us in this room, I would imagine. And so I think the game plan as I see it is I would like to spend about 45 minutes telling you about my obsession with this story, this woman, everything she stood for, what she means to us, what her story has to teach us. And then when I have done that, I would like us to enter into an oral contract. Do we have any lawyers present? None? We do. Okay, then we can enforce this oral contract. And the oral contract is very simple. I am going to disgorge all of my love for this woman for 45 minutes, and then you are going to ask the most brilliant questions this church has ever heard. Do we have a deal? Yeah. We do. And you're going to enforce it? Okay. All right. Okay. Excellent. I want to try and start out by telling you why I would often I would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, because I would be laying in bed and I would be twitching and I couldn't sleep. And the reason I couldn't sleep is because, and this is something that I tell all of my narrative nonfiction students, something they've never heard before. There is this almost magical, mystical connection between good writing and good music. If you take good music and you superimpose it over good writing, it's a snug, tight fit. Good writing is about beat, rhythm, cadence, syncopation. It's about the way the words move across the page. And that movement, depending on the length of the sentences, depending on all kinds of things, those sentences create a rhythm. Those words create a rhythm. You can create a beat. Sometimes it's more important how the sentence sounds than what the content is. And that's a very complicated sentence, and it's a very difficult thing to convey to 20, 21, 22-year-olds. But it's also completely accurate. And when I teach this narrative nonfiction class, we have 1,200, 1,300 majors, and I cherry pick the 10 most promising writers we have, and I enroll them in this class, and it's a very difficult class. And the thing we do, it's a 4-hour class every Monday, 1:30 to 5:20. And the very first thing we do on the first day is I bring in 5 different selections of music. 3 minutes, 4 minutes, Dave Brubeck, take 5. Anybody like Dave Brubeck, take 5? Willie Dixon and the Boxcars, blues, Simon and Garfunkel, The Sounds of Silence, country and western. 5 different kinds of music, and I just make them turn out the lights and just listen to these 5 different 3-minute selections. And I want them to feel what kind of emotion is Dave Brubeck creating in you with the way this hits your ear. And then we turn on the lights and play it again, and I want them to write down what the emotion is from Dave Brubeck to Simon and Garfunkel to Willie Dixon and the Boxcars. And then, after we take a break, when they've done that, I give them 5 different selections of writing. 3 or 4 different paragraphs from Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And if you haven't read 100 Years of Solitude, I would argue it's one of the 5 great novels of the 20th century. I give them 4 or 5 paragraphs of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 4 or 5 paragraphs of Mark Twain, 4 or 5 paragraphs of Ernest Hemingway, 5 or 6 paragraphs maybe of William Faulkner. Totally different kinds of writing. And those words, William Faulkner wrote a sentence that was 3.5 pages. Hemingway wrote some sentences that were 3.5 words. 2 totally different styles, but the beat, the rhythm, the flow, the cadence of those words going across the page, and then I make them, what do you feel when you're reading Jack Kerouac? How is he making you feel? What is he doing? What kind of emotions is he getting? And then the last stage of this is, okay, you take these 5 different kinds of music and you take these 5 different kinds of writing, and I want you to match them up. Who does Dave Brubeck's Take 5 most closely resemble? Is there somebody in this group of 5 writers who has kind of a jazzy rhythm, beat, cadence, syncopation to their writing? And there's no right or wrong answer to any of this. It's just getting their heads geared to understand how immensely useful this concept of good music and good writing, how useful that concept is to becoming a better writer. And that's why I always have them read everything aloud, everything aloud. Your ear is a much better editor than your eye. Your ear will tell you when the syntax is jumbled up on the tracks and the boxcars can't quite move much quicker than your eye can. And so that's something else that they do in the class all the time. So that was an exit ramp off I-80, back on I-80 now. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm twitching. I'm thinking back of something that I wrote at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I know it's a quarter of an octave off, a half an octave off perhaps. It's something, a sentence or a paragraph that I want to sound like Luciano Pavarotti, and it sounds a lot more like Roseanne Barr singing the Star Spangled Banner. I defy anybody in this room to try and sleep through that. You can't. I didn't try. Got up, patted down the steps, put on coffee, looked outside. A lot of mornings It would be January or February, 6, 7, 8 inches of snow on the ground. Ooh, thermometer says 0. And then I think, this amazing woman at age 24 was out in her buggy in 2 feet of snow, numbing cold, pitch dark, trying to become the healer of her people. And you're whining about whether or not you should turn the thermometer from 72 to 74 or make 3 cups of coffee or 4. Shut up and get to work. And so I would. And I would go right back to the computer and open up that paragraph and keep working on it and keep tinkering with it until I was satisfied that the needle had at least tilted more towards Luciano than Roseanne, at which point you could resume sleep. When you are finished sponging up all of the details that you can get, all of the primary source documents, all of the quotes, all of the interviews, all of the newspaper articles, when you have spent a year and a half of research and you're convinced that there is not a single scrap of paper anywhere in the world with Susan LaFlèche's name on it that you don't have, which is how I felt, because that's what I do. That's what I do. That's my background. I'm an investigative reporter in Miami and in New York, and that's what I do. I get information. And so then when you've got that information, okay, now you have to figure out what is the narrative arc of this story. What is the beginning? What is the middle? What is the end? You could start this story 100 different ways. You could end it 50 different ways. You could put things in the middle, infinite combinations of varieties. But you have to have a game plan, and you have to have a very well thought out, well constructed narrative arc that is going to keep the reader interested and keep the reader buoyed up. My job in writing this is to collapse the distance between your eyes and the text on the page. My job as a writer at 3 o'clock in the morning to get the cadence, to get the beat, to take all of this 18 months worth of intense research and boil it down into a narrative is to keep pulling you closer and closer and closer until you're inside the story, until you're not looking at it from a distance, but you are getting pulled until you are looking at the story from the inside out. You're in Susan's buggy. That's where I want you to be. I don't want you to be outside of her buggy, looking out a window, seeing her. I want you to be in that buggy. I want you to feel the darkness. I want you to feel the cold. I want you to hear the snow crunching. I tell my students in these elite writing classes, every reader has 5 senses. Have 5 senses. The more of those senses you can activate, the more you're going to pull that reader inside the story. The more you're going to get that reader in the buggy, if you can make them feel the cold and be a little bit afraid of the darkness and be a little bit worried whether or not Susan's going to be able to get there in time. If you can smell those horses, if you can do all of this, you're going to get the reader in a position where all of this work pays off. All of this work pays off. So when I started looking over all of the mound of information, I started to, okay, now we've got to take 250 pounds of material and sculpt it into a sleek 100-pound narrative arc that keeps the reader moving and keeps the reader inside the story. So the first thing that you often do is look, what are the main themes? What is this story about? If you took this story's 100,000 words and you put it in a strainer, and 99,950 words leaked out of that strainer, and there was only one 25, 30-word sentence left that was the emotional ground zero of the entire book, what would that sentence be? What would this book be about? I asked my students this the other, what's Huckleberry Finn about? And if you tell me it's about a young boy and a runaway slave going down the Mississippi River, I will tell you that would have been acceptable if you were in 5th grade. But since you are a college senior, it's completely, it's not what that story is about. And then one really bright student raised his hand. He said, it's about a young boy finding the moral center of his universe, which was against everything that his elders had told him. Oh, okay. That's what you want to do with, what is this book about, and what are the main themes? What are the main themes that prop this up? So I came up with 3, I think this book can be supported by 3 strong thematic pillars that prop this story up throughout its beginning, middle, and end. 3 very identifiable themes that I was really excited about when I started thinking about them, and I'm excited about talking about them. The editor of this book and the previous book on Standing Bearer is a 40-ish German woman from Stuttgart. Her name is Daniela Rapp, born and raised in Stuttgart. And as a 13 or 14-year-old, 15-year-old, she became obsessed with the American West, to the point where she is now the Western History Acquisitions Editor for St. Martin's Press, this huge, big, powerful, wealthy commercial publishing firm that occupies the 14th and 15th floors of the Flatiron Building, that iconic triangular-shaped building, 23rd and 5th Avenue in New York City that many of you have probably walked by or know about. She is on the 15th floor of that building, and she looks over different books about Western history. So my question to you is, how did 14-year-old Daniela Rapp, growing up in an apartment in downtown Stuttgart, Germany, how did she become acquainted with the American West? This mythic landscape that we know about because we live in it and we travel in it. But how did 14-year-old Daniela Rapp in Stuttgart, Germany, how did she become acquainted with the American West? Any theories on that? Yes, ma'am. She read books. That's one way. Anything else? Yes, ma'am. Sorry? Movies. Books, movies. Anything else that could have gotten her excited about the American West? Walt?
Well, the finest Native American collections are in Germany.
Very true. Very true. Museums. One big one out there that you haven't mentioned. Art. That's, say it again. Teachers, schools. We're nibbling away towards travel. What other American medium has portrayed television? Television. She told me this story one hot August afternoon when I went up to see her to talk about the manuscript on Standing Bear, and she was telling me that she loved American Westerns. She was addicted to American Westerns on TV. And she was, as she was telling me this, she was telling me that one of the reasons she got addicted is they didn't use subtitles. They dubbed in the American Western into German. And she loved Gunsmoke. She loved Have Gun Will Travel. She had a thing for Paladin, sadly. But her favorite, the top of her mountain, was Bonanza. And it's a hot August afternoon. I'm up on the 15th floor of the Flatiron Building, and she's telling me about her favorite TV Western of all time was Bonanza, and I just froze, and I was thinking of walking into a German apartment in Stuttgart and seeing a TV on in the corner of that apartment and Haas Cartwright speaking fluent High German. And it was more than, as I recall, Haas struggled mightily to speak fluent English. Yeah, Paul. And seeing Haas speaking fluent High German was, but that's how she became acquainted. And that's the lead-in to one of the great themes of this book that I used in developing the narrative arc and used to help prop up the narrative arc is when we walk up those steps and we get to the window that gives us this panoramic sweep of the American West, that view from the top of the steps looking out onto this mythic landscape called the American West has always, always, always been refracted through the lens of a man. We know about the American West because of Crazy Horse, George Custer, Sitting Bull, Geronimo, Paladin, Hoss Cartwright, Marshall Dillon. Men have come to define our view of the American West. That's where the movies are routed through. That's what the TV programs are routed. That's what the books, the dime store novels back in the 1870s. That top view has always been dominated by how the American West looked through the eyes of a man. One of the things that I love about this book, one of the things that I loved about this book from day one was when we take that same trip up those same steps and we get to the top and we look out the window and we see the American West through Susan's eyes, it's a much different view. It's a much different American West. It's a much more complicated landscape. It's a much more emotionally interesting landscape to me as I read her letters, as I read contemporaneous newspaper accounts, as I did all of this research and found all of these primary source documents, and I just kept thinking of how different the American West looks when you see it through the eyes of a woman, and not just any woman, but an Omaha Indian woman, and not just any Omaha Indian woman, but an amazing Omaha Indian woman who would be all alone at age 24, at 5 o'clock in the morning, 2 feet of snow, 24 below zero. 1,200 patients scattered across 1,350 square miles of dark, frozen, intimidating reservation land, well before Google Maps, in this buggy all alone, trying to desperately find this log cabin to which she had been given very crude directions a couple days earlier by a relative. You go 3 miles north on Omaha Creek, there'll be a cottonwood tree. Go west a mile, and you'll see a gully, and follow that gully up to the top of the hill. And if you look about 1.5 miles east and continue that direction, you should see a cabin with a telltale plume of smoke coming up. That's what she's trying to find in the dark, in the cold. Because inside that cabin, curled up in a fetal position on the dirt floor in one corner, is a 14-year-old girl dying of tuberculosis. Will Susan be able to find her in time? That's a whole different view of the American West. And the number of mornings in the dark, in the cold, all alone, that this remarkable woman would have these paralyzing anxiety attacks where she, according to her letters, her own words, she would shut down. She would almost be incapable of continuing on because she would be struck in the dark, in the cold, in this huge reservation without any roads. Will I die here all alone? Will I die without ever having had children? Without ever having had a husband? Without ever having had a family? She writes about this. She writes about that fear. That's a view of the American West you don't get with Hoss Cartwright or Marshall Dillon or Paladin or anybody else. Was Crazy Horse worried about that? I don't know. He didn't write a lot of diaries, didn't write a lot of letters. But we know that Susan was, and we know that that is a view of the American West that doesn't come through in the endless John Wayne movies, in the endless dime store novels, in the endless TV westerns. influence. It's that same kind of monolithic view of what the American West looks like through a male lens, which to me is, over time, it just becomes pretty static and pretty predictable. But through Susan's eyes, no, it's much more realistic. It's much more nuanced. It's much more complicated. And to me, it's much more interesting. So that was a great theme, I think, to this story that you wanted to really grasp and run with from the beginning. How is this view of the American West through Susan's eyes different than through George Custer's eyes or Marshall Dillon's? Another really important theme to understanding this story and to build a narrative on, another really dramatically and desperately important theme is you cannot appreciate or embrace or understand the magnitude of this woman's achievement unless you create a really solid historical antecedent. And I was obsessed with that from day one. And by that I mean you have to put Susan LaFleche in the context of the time period that she was trying to become a doctor in. You have to understand how women were viewed in the last quarter of the 19th century. You have to be able, as a writer, to very systematically and very diligently create the historical context so the reader can understand just how impressive it was for her to do what she did. And if you don't create that historical antecedent, if you don't get this into context, when you're writing about anything in nonfiction, you are really doing a tremendous disservice to the story, and in this case, a tremendous disservice to the protagonist in that story. So you have to understand that in the last quarter of the 19th century, the bar for white women was set about an inch off the ground. The expectations were virtually zero. That was for white Christian women. So then you have to explain where that bar was set for an American Indian woman. I mean, we right now have the largest number of women in the U.S. Congress in history. We have 20 U.S. senators who are women in February of 2019. Women are 51% of the population, and theoretically they should be 51 senators in the United States Senate. They're 20. If we go back to the 1870s and the 1880s and we look at the current that Susan was swimming against in her attempt to become a doctor, because as an 8-year-old girl, as an 8-year-old child on the Omaha Reservation, she had sat in a home watching an elderly Omaha Indian woman die, despite 3 different calls to the white doctor on the reservation throughout the night. Did not respond to any of the calls. So this 8-year-old girl on the Omaha Reservation watched in horror as this elderly Omaha woman died this slow, agonizing, painful death early that morning. And she vowed that she would do everything in her power to become a doctor and to come back and take care of her people. And she writes about this. She writes about this eloquently, that after all, she says, it was only an Indian. She wasn't going to let that happen. But it's one thing to think that, and another thing to do what she did. And the historical record is very clear how strong that current was that she was swimming against. And I don't want you to think that I'm engaging in fake news here. I don't want you to take my word for this. This is something else that authors are guilty of. They say they'd like to read a little bit, and then the next thing you know, it's Thursday morning, and you're sound asleep. So I'm not going to do that, but I am going to ask permission to read a couple of paragraphs that I hope will give you a sense of the current that Susan was swimming against by quoting some of the literature that was out there in the height of the Victorian era. Do I have your permission to do that? Thank you very much. Just, and I quote, just therefore, as higher civilization is heralded, or at least evidenced by increasing bulk of brain, just as the most intelligent and the dominant races surpass their rivals in cranial capacity, and just as in those races the leaders, where in the sphere of thought or of action are eminently large-brained, so we must naturally expect that man, surpassing woman in volume of brain, must surpass her in at least a proportionate degree of intellectual power, comma, end quote, proclaimed the December 1878 issue of Popular Science Monthly, one of the most respected scientific journals of the era. Not to be outdone by Scientific Monthly, on the other side of the pond, an issue of the Journal of the Anthropological Society of London asserted, and I quote, during menstruation, women suffer under a languor and depression which disqualify them from thought or action and render it extremely doubtful how far they can be considered responsible human beings while the crisis endures. That's an appropriate response. We're not done. In intellectual labor, man has surpassed, does now, and always will surpass woman for the obvious reason that nature does not periodically interrupt his thought and activities, end quote. So that's bookending both sides of the Atlantic and where the scientific journals of the last quarter of the 19th century regarded the intellectual and emotional staying power of women. And it was because of a small group of strong-willed, powerful women that Susan got into medical school. It was because of this small group of 3 or 4 women who spent some time with her, and all of whom were bedazzled by her focus, her maturity, her concentration, her intellectual powers, that they formed this kind of flying wedge, and they just started knocking down all of these ridiculous obstacles in her way until they finally got her admitted to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, which in the 1880s was the only medical college in the world that accepted women. The only medical college in the world where a woman could enter the front door and three years later walk out the back door with a medical degree. And so Susan had classmates from Damascus, Syria. She had classmates from Calcutta, India. She had classmates from Tokyo. But it was this diminutive Omaha Indian girl from the northeast corner of Nebraska who not only got into the only medical college in the world who would accept women, but graduated on March 14th, 1889 as the valedictorian of her class. And it's a very complicated 3 years that she spends in Philadelphia. Because one of the great taboos in Native culture, regardless of what tribe you're talking about, it doesn't matter, Navajo, Seminole, Micmac, Northern Cheyenne, Ponca, Pawnee, Odo, it doesn't matter. One of the great taboos among these tribes is you never cut up a body. You never desecrate a body. If you cut a body, its spirit will be doomed to roaming the earth forever and will never be able to come home to that body. And Susan had been taught this by her father, Joseph, as well as her other sisters, bringing her up in the Omaha traditional way. And so now she's in Philadelphia. Now she's a second-year medical student. She is well on her way to fulfilling this dream of becoming a doctor and going home and spending the rest of her life taking care of her people. But one of the classes she needs to pass is a class in anatomy that includes doing autopsies, cutting up bodies. And Susan had a very complicated decision to make. She could turn left and honor the tradition of the Omaha people and her father, or she could turn right and do what she had to do to become a doctor. She turned right. And she was haunted by that for many, many years afterwards. But in the end, she never regretted the decision, because the payoff that eventually came was she was saving lives. She was able to put her in a position to save lives. But that second theme of really understanding the magnitude of her accomplishment. I mean, I had a really good friend, and maybe there's some people in here who might know this, but I had a really good friend, Camilla Kokendorfer, a name you can't forget, from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, who in the 1970s, in the mid-1970s, was a first-year medical student at UNMC, and I remember her telling me on many weekends, every week in 1974, doctors at UNMC, white male doctors at UNMC, were telling her to drop out, to go into nursing college, that they did not want to spend all this money and all this time so she could get knocked up and then have to leave and take a spot that could go to a guy. That was in the 1970s. So again, the more you can seed the landscape with the number of obstacles that this young woman from 1,500 miles away was up against, the more incredible and impressive her achievements become. And that's just a very important part, and you've got to get it right. You've got to really go into those journals and find out what the scientific view was and the scientific distinction between X chromosomes and Y chromosomes, according to Popular Science Monthly and the Anthropological Society of London. It's a very important part of this book and this story. And the third and final theme that I think is a really important one in the telling of this story, and it goes back to a little bit of what we were talking about in this, do I cut up this body and violate my cultural traditions? Or do I just justify it by, it's what I have to do to save lives? And it's difficult to say how you would react to that. I mean, you may say sitting here that you know for sure what you would do, but I don't think you would. I think you just have to experience and be there. But the third theme that I think is really important to this story is, this is a story of cultural identity. Something that fascinates me, I think obsessed would not be too strong a word, because I think in the end, virtually everything comes down to identity. Who gets to determine how we see ourselves? At 1 o'clock in the morning, when you're staring into the mirror and all the masks and all the costumes have been stripped away and put in the closet, who is that person? Who is that person in the mirror? Who is that person looking back? And what is it that that person values? What is it that person believes? What is it that created the self-identifiers for that person? Is it the family you were raised in, the parents you had, the part of the country you grew up, the neighborhood, the church you worshiped in? Is that all of those are tributaries that flow into the narrative river of the self? You could probably make a convincing argument what happens? What happens to that self when a more powerful external force comes in and hijacks your culture? What happens when a stronger, more powerful force forbids you to speak your language, forbids you to worship the God you've worshiped for 10,000 years, forbids you to do your traditional ceremonies, to wear your traditional clothing, to sing your traditional songs? Who do you become? How do you see yourself? What are the identifying characteristics that make you who you are? If, as was the case on the Pine Ridge Reservation in the summer of 1882, when the United States government actually issued these directives in writing, and the Lakota were told by the Indian agent that if they were caught speaking Lakota, they could spend 3 days in jail. What happens if you can't pray to your God in the only language that you know? And if you turn the page and read that, oh, also, if you're caught worshiping Wakantanka, you can spend 5 days in jail. Who do you become? Who are you? All of this so often comes down to identity. When there are these big demonstrations over these southern statues that are being torn down in Virginia or Alabama or Mississippi, that's all about identity. It's all about identity. And this interplay between language and culture is often all about identity. Language shapes culture, and culture shapes language. When I was an investigative reporter in Miami in the 1980s, pre-email, pre-texting, pre-almost everything, we all came to our office on the 4th floor of this huge building, 1 block long, 450 reporters, editors, photographers, and we all had a note in our mailbox from the executive editor of the Miami Herald, John C. McMullen. And inside that envelope, that note said, from that day forward, the Miami Herald was banning the word elderly from its news columns. We were no longer permitted to use the word elderly. Why? Because all of the elderly South Florida retirees were tired of reading how elderly they were. And so John C. McMullen's solution in the wake of papers being canceled was to purge the word elderly from the Miami Herald's culture. I've spent thousands and thousands of hours on American Indian reservations all over the country. And I can tell you without exception, wherever that reservation has been, Arizona, Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Iowa, when you're on the reservation, you're among the traditional people, they have a word for somebody when they reach a certain age. And those people on those reservations are referred to as an elder. Now, the difference between elder and elderly is only 2 letters in the alphabet, but connotatively, the gap between those two is Grand Canyon-esque. In many ways, the older you get in our culture, the less value you have. I mean, that's not an impossible thing to really articulate. The older you get in native culture, the more value you have. Because you, as an elder of the Navajo, or the Northern Cheyenne, or the Paiute, or the Lakota, you are the cultural DNA that the tribe needs to maintain its identity. Because you're the one who's telling the children the language, and the songs, and the customs, and the traditions. That's the way it's always worked. That's the way it still works today. So it wasn't an accident that when the government got control of these tribes, and got them herded onto reservations, one of the very first things they did was to outlaw the language. Kill the language, kill the culture. And the last report I saw, there are, as of right now, there are only 9 elders left on the Omaha reservation who speak Omaha, who speak the language. And Susan's genius, to me, this whole idea of identity, Susan's genius was that she was able to thread this very elusive bicultural needle without losing her native soul. And that's not an easy thing to do. That wasn't an easy thing to do back then, and it's not an easy thing to do now. This is a woman who spoke 5 languages fluently, who understood all of the Omaha traditions and culture, and also was a Christian. She attended burial services in the Christian faith, and she administered Omaha burials in the Omaha tradition using the Omaha language. Very, very difficult thing to do. And it's one of the reasons that she is who she is and the great gift that she gave us. I'd like to indulge one more request to read a page and a quarter, if I may. Okay, thank you. It's late evening, early autumn, and the lands she once crisscrossed in her battered buggy and buffalo robe have long ago given way to rich, ripe fields of corn and soybeans unfurling to the horizon. On a slight rise overlooking these verdant fields, a mile south of where the poet John Neihardt lived before he met the Lakota holy man Black Elk, a feathery row of perfect pines stands at attention, sentinels guarding the southern flank. The only sound now in the fading light, the song of the meadowlark from a nearby fence post. Inside the Bancroft Cemetery, fanning out across 3 acres, lie the remains of more than 2,200 village elders, founders, bankers, school teachers, farmers, truck drivers, barbers, bartenders, young children, mayors, sheriffs, hardware owners, meat cutters, pesticide salesmen, families of great-grandparents, grandparents, and grandchildren. A visitor can walk down row after row and see their names: Zalke, Barber, Stahl, Hermelbrecht, Konarski, Scooch, Gatzmeyer, Basinger. Along the southern edge of the cemetery, toward the stand of pines, near the end of one row, a 4-foot-high, simple granite headstone rises from the earth. Susan LaFlèche Peacock, 1865-1915. In the language of her grandfather, the French fur trader LaFlèche, her name means the arrow. And between her birth in the waning weeks of the Civil War and her final resting place, the trajectory of her life would encompass a span of experiences and a range of avocations unlike that of any other Indian woman before or since. As a child, born in a time when her people still lived in teepees and earth lodges, alternating between buffalo hunters and corn growers, she could never have known that one day she would deliver babies, suture wounds, cure fevers and colds, treat tuberculosis and influenza, ban the communal drinking cup, insist on screen doors, and build a hospital in a remote, isolated corner of the Great Plains without a single tax dollar. Back then, in the years after the Transcontinental Railroad and before the Little Bighorn, she could never have known that she would start a library for her people, translate legal documents, cook and deliver meals to the hungry and destitute, preside at funerals, deliver sermons, sing in the choir, and embrace the Native American church. Could not comprehend about what she would accomplish on March 14th, 1889, the day she graduated as valedictorian of her medical school class in Philadelphia, becoming the first American Indian doctor in the 113-year history of her country, 31 years before women could vote, 35 years before all Indians could become citizens in the lands they had lived on for thousands of years. As a young girl growing up on the rich soil of the Missouri River floodplain, Susan LaFleche could never have known that she would come to love her people so much that she would give her life for them, that she would come to love her homeland so much that she could never imagine leaving it. And now, resting peacefully near the perfect pines, on a slight rise above the lush, verdant fields, not far from the song of the meadowlark, she never will. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. This is question and answer period. We respectfully ask that as you have questions, that they actually stay questions instead of comments or opinions on things like that. Certainly you can describe what you're thinking about, but if you would form it into a question for us, that would be most helpful. We'll take about 15 minutes or so for this, and then we'll go out and be able to talk with one another about it. Thanks.
And thank you again for coming. I mean, it's not 72 out, and I don't see a lot of sandals. Again, well, we're Nebraskans. Okay, we have a lawyer in here who can enforce this, as you recall.
How did the Omaha people accept her medical practice?
Almost, everybody heard the question, almost without exception, they enthusiastically embraced her medical practice. To have somebody show up at your cabin in the middle of nowhere, speaking your language, looking like you can't overstate how important that was then and how important that is now. And it was very different from what they were used to. What they were used to is why Susan became a doctor. So they were thrilled. And she spent so much time with them. She started quilting circles. She invited they had quilting circles. She started libraries for the children. She had an office that they came to. And she was out in her buggy. And the problem was for her, because she was tortured. She had these two beautiful boys, Pierre and Carol. And she had a husband. And she loved these two little boys like all mothers do. And so she would stay home with them. And when she stayed home with her young boys, she felt really great, really fulfilled as a mother. But she felt terrible as a doctor. So then she would get her buffalo robe and her buggy and go back out and take care of the patients, and she felt really good as a doctor and really bad as a mother. So mercifully, now in the opening years of the 21st century, women have now figured out how to balance family and career. That's sarcasm. And that was something that really haunted Susan, trying to balance that. But the answer to your question is she had no problems. When you're sick, you have a doctor that speaks your language, you're pretty happy to get that knock on the door.
Hello. There. I was just wondering, were there many white women doctors at this time too, or, you know, were they? I'm sure they were not as numerous as male doctors, obviously, but.
The question is, were there many white doctors at the same time period? We're talking about the last quarter of the 19th century. The answer is no. No. I go, for those of you who've read the book, I go into the story of the first female doctor in the history of the United States who was a white woman. And it's just an apocryphal story. And it's in the book, and what happened to her, she also graduated as the valedictorian of her class. She was the only woman in her class. And it's a long story about how she got in, because the faculty thought it was just a prank that this woman had applied to medical school, that it was a joke and an inside joke, so they went ahead and approved her as part of the joke, not realizing that it was for real. And then she got in, she graduated as a valedictorian, and then she moved to New York, and not a single hospital would allow her to practice. So she had to try and open her own private medical facility, which was a struggle. But she went, knocked on doors. Every single hospital in New York refused to hire her. There were, I've got the percentage, I think by 1900, I think it was, or in the late 1890s, 1888, 1892, around there, 3% of the doctors in the United States were female. 3 out of every 100 in the 1890s. Very, very small percentage.
What kind of tools did she have, given that there were no antibiotics or pain meds or any of that kind of thing?
You know, a lot of what Susan, a lot of her emphasis was on preventive care. She insisted, one of the big problems were flies. And one of the things she taught her people was to sprinkle kerosene in the corners of the room, particularly the damp areas, to use screen doors. The communal drinking cup had been a part of Omaha Native culture forever. Everybody would drink out of the same cup. She forbid that. She did have access to some basic medicine, but it was almost always in short supply because it wasn't easy to get medicine to the Omaha Reservation in the 1890s. She also used native plants that native people had used forever to help with some of the medical issues. So it was kind of a hodgepodge of, let's do everything we can from a prevention standpoint. Let's get what medicine we can, and let's also use some of the natural grasses and plants that our ancestors have been using forever. The Lakota, for example, marijuana is something they use to treat asthma. People with asthma back in the 1700s, if they had breathing problems, they would be taken into a tent and they would burn marijuana, and that was something they used for asthma. There are all kinds of medicinal purposes. That's where medicine comes from, as we know, from plants, and they're the reason why these people survived. And the medicine women of each tribe, it was a very special position to have, and it was passed down from mother to daughter to mother to daughter, the medicine women of the tribe, and they became fundamentally important, and Susan tapped into that, not exclusively, but she was using every tool she could to try and save her people who had no resistance to tuberculosis and influenza and whooping cough and malaria. No resistance to that whatsoever.
We have a question here.
My question actually kind of, you answered it sort of at the tail end of your answer to her question. How did the medicine women accept her with her contemporary medical degree or whatever?
Yeah.
I'm trying,
Yeah.
lost my words. Anyway.
The longer it went on, the more acceptance there was. I mean, by 1913, Susan was spending so much time traveling this giant reservation, 1,350 square miles, that she could only see like 4 or 5 families a day. And she would leave at 5 o'clock in the morning, and as you can see in her letters, sometimes she would not get home until after 10 o'clock at night. And she would end some of her journal entries with, went to bed shortly after 11, too tired to eat. And she'd get up at 5 o'clock. So it was very inefficient. And so her dream all along was to build a hospital in Walt Hill, in the epicenter of the reservation, and to use all of the modern equipment and all of the modern techniques, and that's what eventually happened. I mean, she did blend in. There was no, by the 1900, 1905, 1908, there was no real animus between the traditional medicine women and the modern, because Susan, I mean, she got results. She got results. And when this hospital was opened in 1913, it was incredible. I mean, it is almost insane to think that this one woman raised enough money on her own to build a modern hospital in the middle of this reservation without a single dollar of tax money. And the ceremony, and if you go back and look at the Walt Hill Times, if you go back and just pull that edition, when they covered the opening, it's just amazing. They had 2 surgical rooms in the hospital. They had nurses, and that is a very easy segue to, for those of you who don't know, and I know a number of you do, that there is a really robust, concerted, energetic, possibly fanatical effort afoot to restore Susan's hospital in Walt Hill to its original architectural integrity. And there's a very dynamic committee filled with a lot of powerful people who get things done, who are working very hard to restore this hospital. And Walt, is it accurate to say that there is now funding available to replace the roof in this hospital? Because that, if that can't be replaced, then, all is lost. But this effort already is bearing fruit. It has been designated nationally as the seventh most what? Is the accurate? It's the 7th most desperately needed structure to be preserved in the entire country. So there's a lot of effort to restore this, and it's a beautiful building. I mean, Susan believed in sunlight and fresh air as being the ultimate restorative. And architecturally, her hospital reflects her preventive medical philosophy. There's this grand porch that faces east, and the hooks are still in the ceiling. This outdoor veranda where she would hang hammocks and put some of the patients in these hammocks on this veranda so they could face the sun and get this screened-in breeze coming without the flies and the mosquitoes. So she was working everything she could. Native medicine, native plants, hospitals, verandas, fresh air, sunlight, kerosene, banning the cup. She was doing everything she could to keep her people alive.
Can it be restored as a working facility?
Can it be?
Or is there another hospital in the area that's been built in the meantime?
Yes, well, you know, they're the closest, the first part of your answer is, can it be restored as a modern hospital? I would say the answer to that is no. Is there the nearest hospital? There's a hospital on the Winnebago Reservation, which is just about 5 miles north of Wald Hill. That hospital has been in and out of trouble in terms of it being functioning. The closest one that is always functioning is in Sioux City, 55 miles north of Wald Hill. Walt, you can update that. I may have misstated some of that.
There is plans to have some medically related tribal offices.
Yes.
Part of the plans for restoration is to have tribal-operated, health-related offices there. There will be a museum there. A lot of the equipment, the instruments that she used. There will be a walk-in clinic as well, but not a hospital,
Right.
per se.
Something on the first floor that would honor Susan's legacy that is health-related, as well as a museum where her black bag and some of her stethoscope, her instruments will be preserved. They are preserved and will be a part of the effort when it's finished.
I wondered how her husband dealt with the fact that she was gone so much of the time, and what happened to her boys.
So how did her husband deal with that? Truthfully, he drank a lot of liquor. And he died of alcoholism. One of the great, great sorrows in Susan's life, because she really loved him, but she couldn't save him. And she was fanatical in her public outcries about alcohol and the destruction that it was causing. She would go to the state capitol in Lincoln and rail in front of the senators, against the whiskey peddlers who were setting up camp on the reservation borders. She would talk anywhere, anytime to anybody, including John Neihart, about the scourge of alcohol. But she couldn't save her own husband, Henry Peacock, who drank himself to death. And it was the great sorrow of Susan's life. The two sons, one of them led just a very kind of ordinary life, but Carol, the other one, both of them enlisted in World War I. They fought in World War I before they were citizens of their own country. They were fighting for the United States government in the United States Army 7 years before they were citizens. Carol was captured and he was in World War II and was a survivor of the Bataan Death March. He had spent a lot of time, both of them had, but Carol in particular had spent a lot of time. He loved horses. He spent a lot of time growing up as Susan's son on the Omaha Reservation, around horses, riding horses. As a survivor of the Bataan Death March, he eventually moved to Orange County, California in the 1940s, and he started raising horses. And his claim to fame was that one of his horses on his horse farm in the 1940s in Orange County sired Trigger. I can't tell my students that story. I have no What? But I'm glad I can tell it here. There's wisdom, yes.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm wondering, you mentioned early on something about the misinformation regarding menstruation and fears people had about women's competency. Also in our kind of modern era, a lot of women have taken up the idea of the red tent, the women's circles, the supportive nature of women amongst one another, teaching the young girls about their maidenhood and their fertility, and then their motherhood time and then their aging as crones. So I'm wondering if Susan experienced among the tribes women who had this wisdom of what it was to be a woman in all the stages of women's lives, and if they taught her, I mean, she had children, I mean, were their ways respected as wisdom ways, and was she able to be supported in that when it came to women's health and reproductive health?
That is a really, really great question, and I don't have a clue as to what the answer is. That is a really great question. I uncovered nothing in my research that I would feel comfortable banking an answer on. It's a really great question, and there's undoubtedly an answer to it. It's just that I don't have it. So I'm really sorry about that. Sure.
What was the role of Christian churches in getting education for this woman?
What was the role of Christian churches in getting an education for Susan LaFlèche? They had a very strong role. Susan's educational career began on the Omaha Reservation in the Presbyterian Mission Church, which was the educational foundation of the Omaha Reservation in the 1870s and 1880s. There probably was no family in the history of Native America. I think I could quite competently prove this, that there was not a family quite like the LaFlèche family in all of Native America. Susan was the youngest of 4 daughters of Joseph and Mary LaFlèche. And Joseph also had several children, another wife. And if you look at what these children accomplished, Joseph, look, all of these chiefs in the last quarter of the 19th century, they had horrific decisions to make. Again, who knows what we would do, any of us, if you were in their place. There was a fork in the road, and they had to make a decision. Do they maintain their own ways at all costs and perhaps perish? Or do they assimilate, compromise, give a little to get a little? Joseph LaFlèche decided that he was going to assimilate. That's what he was going to teach his children. That's how he believed they could survive, and if they didn't do that, they wouldn't survive. He believed passionately that education was the key to the castle. That's what he taught his children. He did not allow them to speak after the age of 10. They were not allowed to speak the Omaha language in their house. This is in the 1870s. They had to speak English. In the 1870s, there was an American Indian chief in northeast Nebraska who saw that far ahead. And he believed that he had to do everything he could to position his children in order for them to succeed. Because there was a new world order, and they were going to have to try and hold on to as much of their traditional culture as possible while integrating in the best of white culture and marry it with the best of Native culture. And so he insisted that they know Omaha and Oto and the Omaha tradition, but also that they were fluent in English. And they went to the Presbyterian Mission Church, and that's where the education began. And it was the connections through the Presbyterian Mission Church that got Susan to Elizabeth, New Jersey, in this private girls' school at age 14. She took a train from the Omaha Reservation to Elizabeth, New Jersey. I mean, if I had a 14-year-old daughter now and put her on a train to Elizabeth, New Jersey, it'd be terrifying for any number of reasons if you've been to Elizabeth, New Jersey. But in 1879, to put a 14-year-old girl on a train and send her, Susan followed her sister, her older sister, Bright Eyes, who was the oldest of the 4 girls, was the first American Indian, male or female, who actively stumped for citizenship rights. Bright Eyes traveled up and down the East Coast. She went to Ireland. She went to England. talking about how Indians needed to get citizenship. She was a political activist, the first of Native people. That was Susan's role model. Another half-brother, Francis, was the first Native American ethnographer in U.S. history. Susan was the first Native American doctor in U.S. history. That's a pretty impressive family. And a lot of it had to do with the mother who tended to the Omaha tradition and culture, and the father who insisted they learn English and get an education. And it was through the Presbyterian Mission Church that opened the door at many, many stops along the way to the education. They were players in getting Susan from Elizabeth, New Jersey to Hampton in Hampton, Virginia, where she graduated number 2 in her class. They were also involved in helping her, along with 3 or 4 powerful women, in getting her into the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. So that church mission was really, really important in being the lead domino that set in motion a lot of her education, whether it was on the reservation, then Elizabeth, New Jersey, then Hampton, Virginia, and finally Philadelphia. The church that mission played a pretty pivotal role in making that happen.
Please help me thank.
Oh, thank you.
We have some
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have some countryside swag to
We got
give
some
you
swag,
as a
okay.
thank you for you to go home.
Okay.
But we're going to let you excuse right now and head out toward the table so that you get ahead of all the folks that.
Yeah, and
are
I'll
gonna
just
be
say in
back.
closing, and I used to feel kind of a little bit shameless about this. I don't at all now because I've swallowed the Kool-Aid on this big time. Because of her, because of Standing Bear. Yeah, I set up a scholarship fund 4 years ago for Nebraska Native American high school graduates. Everything I make from book sales, from speaking engagements, from honorarium goes into that scholarship. I've got 16 Native American students from Winnebago, from Macy, from Walt Hill, from the Santee Reservation, and starting last year from some of the schools in Alliance and Scottsbluff and Gering, who are in different colleges. Some are at UNL, majoring in early childhood education. There's others who are in cooking school, I don't care what it's for, as long as I can help create a bridge from high school to a post-secondary education that will create a job, that will generate a paycheck, that will make them stakeholders in whatever community they live. Because if you spend any time on the reservation, any reservation, there is no future after high school if you don't have a game plan. You just become another white cross in the ditch. And there's enough of them already. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
While he's getting set up for book sales and signing the books, I would like to personally invite you to 2 more events in this series of our Center for Faith Studies lecture series for this year. We have one more in this location. We are hosting the Institute for Holocaust Education and their Holocaust Survival Series. We have Peter Metzlar, who will be with us on March 26th at 7 o'clock, and that'll be right here in this sanctuary. And then April 11th, we will have Dr. Ayman Safi, who is the director of the Islamic Studies Center at Duke University. And he will be here as a part of our celebration as this congregation moves to be a part of the Tri-Faith Initiative at the corner of 132nd and Pacific. So we are the primary Christian presence in that initiative, and we are moving We've already moved all of our stained glass windows and a bunch of other things, and we've got boxes all over the place now that we're storing stuff in and labeling so that we can move. By the end of March, we will be moving to that new location, and our very first speaker is Dr. Ayman Safi. He does progressive Muslim conversations, and he introduces us to the whole mystical, spiritual kind of understanding of the Islamic tradition that you may or may not have had any kind of interest in or information about. There's a lot of poetry, and there's some fabulous wisdom in the midst of that whole tradition. And Center for Faith Studies was actually based on interfaith studies. So for Countryside to be a part of the Tri-Faith Initiative is something that we are truly celebrating here, and we'd love to have you come help celebrate our very first speaker in our brand new building. And that's April 11th at 7 o'clock. It's in your bulletin. So I hope that you will be able to join us. And thank you very much. If you will fill out your cards and drop those in the baskets on the information station there before you go too, we'll be able to make sure that we take all of your comments into consideration as we provide more and more speaking opportunities for you to come and be a part of the conversation. Thank you so much for being here tonight.